Hello and welcome back to the Big Sky Business Insight Summit. Thank you for joining us. For those of you who couldn't join us previously in the day, we had a great presentation from economist Bryce Ward, who talked a little bit about the current state of the bioscience and biotech industry in Montana. Talked a little bit about some of our key challenges, some of those being that you can't really just invent a cluster in an industry out of whole cloth, that you really do need a lot of luck and key ingredients. He also talked about the challenges of being in these remote areas and being relatively isolated as communities. In our conversations with the governor, we heard how some of our key industries were able to participate in assisting him with some of that COVID response, filling in some of the gaps that he found in some of the federal role and response. He also talked about some of the things that we have done as Montanans to overcome some of those challenges that Bryce Ward talked about. Specifically, he talked about this being a state with one small town and a long main street, which we hear from him a lot. But I think that speaks to the relationships and the conversations that we have amongst each other as members of the Montana community to get to know each other and understand how we can help each other get through hard times. And I think we'll hear more about that today. For me, in my perspective, that really is what is going to allow us to be successful in Montana, is to understand where are our strengths, what is our history. And if we understand that and we know it well, then we can really use that as the springboard and foundation to be much more resilient and successful going forward, and really is this entire spirit of this summit. So I think what we're going to hear from our panelists today is a conversation that is going to show us that it's been decades now since some of these early, maybe serendipitous relationships and interests in Montana led to early bioscience evolving here, and how that led to where we stand today, which is a really exciting and robust set of professionals, both in private industry and in government and in the educational and research institutions, who really help us punch above our weight. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator. Again, I'm honored and grateful to Dr. Marshall Bloom, the director of the Rocky Mountain Lab, for sharing his time and expertise with us today. He will introduce the rest of the panelists. Before I turn it over to him, I'll just make sure that everybody understands that this is different than our previous segments, in that as a panel, we're going to have a conversation amongst the panelists and then invite in questions from the audience.
Grant, thanks for giving us the chance to get together and brag a little bit about the various organizations and departments that we represent in the state of Montana. And I'd like to thank everyone who's watching us virtually for tuning in to this first day of the 3-day Big Sky Business Insight Summit. The topic for the summit this year, no surprise, is the COVID-19 pandemic, and how the various biomedical research, often referred to in the vernacular as bioscience, and health and education sectors in Montana were able to aid in our state's relatively strong response. Not to say there weren't challenges, but most of those challenges were sort of external. The specific topic for the first day is Montana's strong foundation, meaning the strong foundation in the biomedical sciences, and how that strength was able to play a role in our state's response. We just had a really interesting fireside chat with Governor Steve Bullock, who's tried to navigate a straight and honest course in this fractious state, and to utilize the appropriate bioscience assets represented among our panel members. So the panel this afternoon, and we have a fair amount of time, provides an opportunity to hear from 4 really key players in Montana's bioscience arena. The goal is to show that Montana has a long and deep history in the biosciences, and that history made it possible for the state to marshal a rapid, robust, and we hope durable response to the challenges of COVID-19, and then, of course, to COVID-20 and 21 and whatever else is going to be coming down the line. So in order to keep things simple and to try to avoid as many virtual gremlins as possible, I'm going to introduce the panelists all at once in the order in which they'll speak, and then each will talk about 10 minutes, and then the next speaker can turn on his or her mic and talk. And then, so here's the order. And then luckily, if we're lucky, we'll have some time at the end for some of the questions. First is Jay Evans. Jay is currently the director of the Center for Translational Medicine at the University of Montana in Missoula and the CEO of Inimmune Corporation. Before that, Jay had a 16-year career in biotech at GSK vaccines down here in Hamilton, where I'm located, but Inimmune is located at the UM campus in Missoula. Our second panelist is going to be Jason Carter, who's the relatively new Vice President for Research, Economic Development, and Graduate Education at MSU. As I recall, Jason, you've been at MSU for just a tiny bit over about a year or so. And before coming to Bozeman, Jason had a very distinguished career in the academic sciences, and I think the university there is lucky to have him. The third is Bob Goodwin, who's a longtime player in the biotech field. He's the CEO now at the moment of Vibliome Therapeutics, a drug discovery company in Bozeman, and was started long ago as the founder of Ligosite Pharmaceuticals in Bozeman. And fourth is Dr. Maggie Cook-Shimanek, who represents the state government. Maggie's the medical director for the Montana Department of Labor and Industry and also a physician for the Montana Department of Public Health and Human Services. I'm going to be the final panelist in case we run out of time. I'm a virologist for about 50 years, and as Grant mentioned, the Associate Director for Scientific Management at Rocky Mountain Labs in Hamilton. RML is part of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, and my boss is Tony Fauci, who many of you have probably heard about. So with that, I'm going to turn off my mic. And Jay, I'm going to turn it over to you, and then you turn it over to Jason, and then Dr. Goodwin, and then to Dr. Cook-Shimanek. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody for joining today, and thanks Dr. Bloom for the introduction. It was a great fireside chat with you and the governor earlier, and answered a lot of questions I think people have about the state's response to COVID and how it interacts on the national level. And I'd also like to thank Grant and the Missoula Economic Partnership for putting on this great forum of interest, I think, to everybody in our community. I'm going to give a pretty brief introduction to both the Center for Translational Medicine here at the university as well as Inimmune to make sure we have plenty of time for question and answer and discussion. I'll give a little bit about the history because it's unique and how we ended up here in Missoula. Of course, we've founded our company and the Center for Translational Medicine both at the same time in January of 2016 as an offshoot from our operations down in Hamilton at GlaxoSmithKline, which actually started from Rocky Mountain Labs. So there's a long history of vaccine and immunotherapy and research here in Montana, and our group is a good example of that. Really, our group was started in 1980, 81 with Edgar Reeby Immunochem, up through the years. In 2016, when we decided to branch out from GSK and start the Center for Translational Medicine at the University of Montana, we also decided to develop a unique public-private partnership with the University of Montana to the benefit of the Montana-Missoula community. At the time, we had basically 15 founders that came up from GSK, longtime vaccine research and discovery and development team. And since then, because of the public-private partnership, we've grown that to 50 employees now in Missoula, working in vaccines and immunotherapy with partnerships all over the world. So when COVID, it became apparent that COVID was not going to remain in China and was likely to spread to the U.S., we had early discussions with NIAID starting in February. We started a COVID vaccine program here in Missoula at the university in March, and now have received 2 batches of supplemental funding from NIH to spearhead not only our own homegrown vaccine discovery program, but also to help other universities and help NIH compare different vaccine candidates head-to-head here at the University of Montana and in collaborators to try to identify the next generation vaccine candidate, one that would be an adjuvanted what we call an adjuvanted subunit vaccine that would hopefully help with the durability as well as the duration and breadth of the response against a vaccine. Of course, we all hope that the current vaccines in phase 1 clinical trials are highly successful and provide 90% protection for the general public. But in reality, the history of vaccines shows that at times a first vaccine will be released, and then you make improvements to that vaccine over time to make things that are even more efficacious, or if there's potential safety signals that come up with the early vaccines, next generation vaccines that improve upon those safety signals. So that's the focus of what we're doing here at the University of Montana on the COVID vaccine front and in partnership with Inimmune. But what I want to point out is that we have a unique way of working here between Inimmune and the Center for Translational Medicine that works for us in a state like Montana. We hire a lot of students from the University of Montana as well as Montana State University. We're educating those students in how a biotech company runs, how intellectual property works, and the inner workings of how biotech and pharma industry work to prepare them not only for careers here in Montana, but from wherever they might go. And as you've heard recently, our vaccine programs span far beyond COVID. We have programs in TB and influenza. We have an opioid vaccine research program that recently received a lot of press here at the university, as well as working on things like cancer and allergy immunotherapy. So with that, I think I'll jump over to the next speaker and leave plenty of time for questions and answers about our COVID vaccine work, but as also how we developed this unique public-private partnership, which allowed a company like Inimmune to grow here in Montana to the extent we have to date. So with that, I will put on mute, and I believe, is it Jason that's next? Yes. So introduce Jason Carter from MSU, and take it away.
All right. Thanks so much, Jay. And I've got the opportunity. Congratulations on that opioid grant. I mean, as a $30 million grant, that's amazing work that you're doing up there in Missoula. I do serve as the Vice President for Research, Economic Development, and Graduate Education at Montana State. And as Marshall mentioned, I'm about 14 months into it. So what a year to transition into this role. It's been amazing. It's been fun, but remarkable. And what I want to share with you today are just two small caveats of the efforts that have been going on. As Governor Bullock mentioned, we were brought into the fight back in July to help out with some testing capacity. I'll talk a little bit about that. But to start, one of the things Marshall asked is a little bit of the history. And for me, being here 14 months, I actually called up Rob, who's going to talk next, and talk to Mark Judula, and got a little bit of that history. But as part of my crew putting together sort of that history for me, I have here, I'm going to share, we're going to try sharing screen here just to show you this. We practiced this, and there it should show up. Does everybody see that slide, Marshall? Yes, good. So this is just one slide that I asked Daniel Giuliano, my director of tech transfer, to put together, just to give me a scope of MSU spin-out companies. And I asked him to kind of categorize it in chunks that would make sense. And you can see here that it is no surprise the biotech, which we're talking about here today. If you know about Bozeman and the Bozeman area and MSU, you know we have a very strong optics and photonics industry as well. We've got agriculture and software and then some other companies. But what really struck me about this slide is you can see it, and we're missing some companies. Is that the more I show this, it's like, oh, what about so-and-so? And we're building this out. You can see Rob's association down here with Ligosite Pharmaceuticals dating back all the way into the late 90s there, and has been successful in transition. But what I want you to take away from this slide is Montana State University has been very involved in biotech throughout the years. It will continue to be. It's definitely probably the strongest piece of our portfolio from an economic development perspective, for many ways, not just the spin-out companies, but also from the perspective of the the spillover effects of having a $167 million research program on our campus, and the jobs it creates, and the people that it brings in and produces. And that's where I want to go with most of my time, is to talk about a couple of the remarkable folks and individuals that helped answer the call when Governor Bullock called. And I'm going to rewind us to back in March. And ironically enough, where all this started here at MSU Bozeman in our fight with COVID was I brought together some of our expert microbiologists, immunologists, virologists a few weeks before what was supposed to be the National Conference for Undergraduate Research called NCUR. And we were going to bring 4,000 people from all over the U.S. to Bozeman for this conference. And we were still debating at that particular time, believe it or not, should we still try to host this conference? And looking back at that now, it seems so ridiculous. But the administration asked me to reach out to some of our experts, unanimously said, we have to cancel. We have to cancel the conference. And I said, well, we're all here. I want to know, what do you think? What are we capable of doing here at Montana State to help in this fight? And man, just ideas started flying all over the place. And so we started to build this repository of what we could do. And it became very clear with our expertise in qPCR and all the expertise that we had on campus and the machinery that we could help. And so we raised our hand at that time. And we got a very polite thanks, but no thanks. I've learned this about Montana. Coming from Michigan, I hear this phrase a lot, stay in your lane, right? And I understand where that comes from, because people drive 100 miles an hour and you want to stay in that lane when you're here in Montana. But in all seriousness, the lanes have widened here in this fight, right? I mean, what used to be something very, very much oriented towards the universities or industry or government or public health, we've all had to join that fight. And so if we fast forward, we had this list of equipment, list of expertise, list of things that we could do. And I know the University of Montana did something very similar, talking with Scott Wittenberg. And come fast forward to July, and one unsung hero in this fight, and I know you're going to hear from him tomorrow, is General Matthew Quinn. He has really, really helped this state. And he was on a phone call with the White House. And the statement was made, why are you not engaging with your universities? Other states have, and he came away from that, reached out, and we were very quickly able to stand up a testing lab. At that time, they had asked us, do you think you can do some asymptomatic surveillance for us? They were having problems with the contract with Quest Diagnostics. We said, sure, that doesn't require CLIA certification. We're ready. 3 days later, well, we just determined you need CLIA certification. Back to your question, Dr. Bloom, about how things changed over the course of this coming out of the federal agencies. So now all of a sudden we're searching around trying to figure out how we can get CLIA, and we were able to do that because of the expertise that we had on campus. So then we're now CLIA certified. We can do diagnostic testing for the state. So it started out at 500. We were able to successfully navigate 500 a day. Then they asked us, well, do you think you can ramp up to 750 a day? Yes, we can. And then just recently, we've gone up to 1,000 a day. And just to put that into perspective, I just, before this, made sure I was correct on this. I asked General Quinn how many tests approximately the state lab is processing per day up in Helen. It's about 1,200 to 1,300 tests a day. And then they send a lot out, of course, to the reference lab in North Carolina. And I've also heard most recently that University of Montana has now obtained CLIA certification, will be joining this fight as well. So we are maximizing the research infrastructure here. And what I've come to try to narrate with this is it's the people, right? And it all started with those group of faculty that were willing to brainstorm and talk about what they could do. And because the state said thanks, but no thanks at first, we then had a faculty member by the name of Michelle Flanagan who said, okay, well, we can relocate our machinery over to Bozeman Deaconess and we can train them in. And that's what we did back in April. And then fast forward, and we've got two remarkable individuals by the name of Deborah Kyle and Seth Walk, who together, Deborah has the CLIA certification and Seth is an expert in qPCR. We stood up the testing lab. And so I've said this a few times in the recent weeks, if there's ever been a time that Montana has benefited from having an R1 infrastructure university in the state, it's been now. We've seen that. We've seen the benefits to the broader community, where we processed 1,500 tests on Saturday because the state was backlogged on some of theirs. And they said, do you think we can press you over this weekend? and Seth's team and Deb's team processed 1,500 in that single day on Saturday. So remarkable efforts, and it's all because of the ingenuity. We have our engineering faculty contributing by helping us make specialized 3D printing aspects to help us expedite this process. And I don't want to make this just all about Montana State University, because our friends across the way over at University of Montana are joining this fight as well, and have now gotten the CLIA certification and are going to start joining this fight as well. We continue to collaborate with them. I'm a firm believer that all boats rise with the rising tide, and so to have a university here in the central portion that is doing $167 million in research, complemented by a $100 million enterprise over in Missoula. I don't know of many other businesses that firm up to $260 some million worth of research and revenue and expertise to the state. So I do think, Marshall, it's higher education and specifically the research universities and what they've been able to bring to this fight shows why Montana is a special state. I don't think you find many other states that have two large research institutions that can join this fight with such a small population that we have. And I think that is a part of the story. And I was really happy to hear the governor mention that. I'll end by saying this. I think on the backside of COVID, we're going to come out even stronger if we continue to do what we're doing and we continue to fight this. I had somebody tell me one time, I asked about COVID and what they thought was going to happen with COVID. And they said, well, we've seen three booms in the economy and people in Montana. It was when Brad Pitt showed up with a fishing rod. It was after 9/11, and it was after the 2008 recession. And I think we're going to see that again. I think we're going to see that in the biotech area. I think we're going to see that in the university systems. And I'm really happy that research at our universities is part of that narrative. So I hope that was what you were looking for. If it's not, it's what you got. But I appreciate being invited to talk a little bit more about this. And you're going to hear from one of our superstar researchers tomorrow with Blake Wiedenheft. He really was the first one to get into this fight, testing wastewater. And I didn't cover wastewater because I know Blake is going to cover it tomorrow. But just some remarkable faculty here. And I want to thank you for the opportunity. And we'll turn it over to Rob now.
Thank you, Jason. And it's really great to hear everything that you guys have been doing for COVID. I mean, I think MSU has really stepped up. I know U of M has as well. And frankly, there's been a lot of stepping up to do. So I think couldn't come at a better time. And thanks to the organizers for having me. My background's in drug development. I've been doing drug development in Montana for more than 20 years. And as a big state with a small population, most of us in the business have interacted in different ways at different times in different collaborations, and sometimes under different umbrellas. So I'm going to tell a couple of quick stories. One is a story of a company called Ligocyte that grew up in Bozeman. I wasn't a founder, but I came in early. It was actually founded by some MSU faculty members and a couple of non-faculty members who were all experts in immunology and immune cell function. And if you understand how immune cells work, then you know that when they're overactive or hyperactive, then you can have an inflammatory disease or an autoimmune disease. And then sometimes when you want the immune system to work harder, you give it a nudge with a vaccine or train it to go after a certain type of protection against viruses and bacteria. So vaccine development is really centrally founded on immunology, but also there's a lot of drug development that looks at immune function and how the immune system works. And Ligocyte was an immunology company. We started as a service company, but then transitioned into drug development. And when we started to look at drug development, what we were doing was really what I would call translational development. And I know this is similar to what Jay is doing at U of M. The translational development means that we don't necessarily make the pure discoveries at our company. We rely on a lot of work that's happening in academic institutions. So we did a lot of work with MSU But we were also working closely with Harvard and Baylor and University of Maryland and Cincinnati Children's Hospital. And we got a lot of work done by leveraging a lot of early biology that was happening somewhere else. And our job was to take those discoveries and turn them into things that look like drugs. So we had to bring the expertise of what it's like to deal with the FDA. How do you manufacture something? What do larger drug companies look for when they want to bring programs in? Because in today's world and back then and 20 years from now, small companies are probably not going to be the companies that are making and selling drugs. That's something that big companies do really well. What big companies don't do as well these days is they don't support the discovery and early stage, very risky development stage of things. And there's a whole ecosystem where you have academic discoveries that are transitioned into small biotech companies that eliminate some risk and then ultimately translate to larger biotech companies, small pharma companies that run very expensive clinical trials or continue to run those trials. And finally, you might get into a large pharmaceutical company that has 30,000 people, and they'll be the ones to make and sell a drug. But it takes incremental progress in all those different stages. And small biotech companies tend to operate sort of early to mid stage in that. We were able to bootstrap the company on grants and contracts through the NIH and Department of Defense and some angel money that was around in the state at the time. But there was no venture capital based in Montana 20 years ago. So we hit the road and hit the coast and convinced institutional venture capital to fund the company. Ultimately, between the grants and contracts and the venture money, we brought more than $100 million into the state. And that translated to work that we funded directly at MSU, and it translated to work that we funded at other institutions and collaborations. We paid for clinical trials. And I mean, it was a big impact, I think locally, but also in the state. I think any company that raises money and spends it is contributing greatly to the economic development in the state of Montana. So we can make a big dent there. I think we set up our labs across the street from Montana State University for lots of reasons that are kind of obvious to us, but they're worth stating. It's not just that we have research collaborations going on. We hire students, and we also use some core facilities. There's access to veterinarians and animal facilities and nuclear magnetic resonance machines that no company can afford to buy when they're just starting up. Scanning electron microscopy, things like that are housed at a research university that we really depend on in order to do the work and do it at a high level. And ultimately, Ligocyte was acquired by one of those large pharmaceutical companies. They were called Takeda, and they had 30,000 people, and they brought us in to form a new division, which was a global vaccine division. So they looked around the world for a company that they could acquire, and we were their first acquisition. And I think that's really important because it's important to say that the work that goes on in Montana at the research institutions and at small companies that are doing biotech work, it's world-class work. It holds up to any work that's being done in large, prestigious East Coast universities and big West Coast universities and large companies. We do very high-quality work. And we're also in Montana. So those two things aren't mutually inclusive or exclusive. But that's one of the things we found as we got out around the world and started to talk to people and raise money is that the work that we're doing here is very, very high caliber. And the other part that's important there is the people who do the work are incredibly talented, but they're also even-keeled, and they tend to be non-political, and they're reliable and they work hard. And as we integrated into the larger pharmaceutical company, that really stood out as however you describe the Montana work ethic, it's a thing that's recognized when you have big groups of people working together, and it was really appreciated. Since I left the large pharmaceutical company, I started a new company in Bozeman. It's called Vibliome Therapeutics. It is a drug discovery company. So we are developing a type of a small molecule drug, a synthetic chemical drug called a kinase inhibitor. We work across many different kinases. It's a class of drugs that's used a lot in cancer therapy, and it's been very successful in increasing the length of time that cancer patients have a high quality of life. And in addition to cancer, we're also using those same technologies to look at immune diseases and immune function. And it's one of the things that's come up with COVID. We know that there's an immune component to why people become especially sick and why some people don't become especially sick when they get infected. We don't yet completely understand what are the triggers that send people down those different paths, but we know that an overactive immune system late in the course of disease can be detrimental. And we also know that you need a competent immune system certainly early in the course of disease. And if you want to mount a response, an immune response, that'll give you protection long term, either from a vaccine or if you make it through an infection. So immunology is a really important part of how we look at COVID today. And there are a number of drugs that we're working on and that are available that might be useful once we understand a little bit more about the timing and how to adjust treatment for those patients. So I think that's the story of Ligocide and Vibliome, and I can't stress enough that having access to high quality space, being next to a research university, those are two things that were really, really important to us and will be important to all the companies that want to grow up and follow in Montana. With that, I think I'll stop and hand off to Maggie Cook-Shimanek at the Health Department. Maggie?
Thank you. I appreciate it, Dr. Goodwin. And I appreciate the opportunity to join this panel of participants who have had really key roles in the pandemic response. As Dr. Bloom mentioned, I work for the Department of Labor and Industry, and then I also work part-time for the Department of Public Health and Human Services, both of which I think have played different but critical roles in the response. I started with DPHHS actually in January of 2020 because I was interested in kind of exercising some of my public health training, as that's one of the areas I have board certification in. And it turned out to be really nice timing in terms of some of the experiences that I have, which I'm going to discuss in a bit. I think that the COVID-19 pandemic has really brought to light how much the workplace really intersects with public health. And that's become acutely evident even as we were considering exposure guidance and recommendations for workplace mitigation for essential workers when we had even had the stay-at-home order, but then also and especially when we started reopening and people were returning to businesses to work in some instances. So it's really clearly apparent that healthy businesses rely on that healthy workforce. And really DLI's primary role has been managing the unemployment insurance side of the pandemic response, which is substantial. And they've managed the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, which was basically designed to expand unemployment insurance benefits to those who weren't covered by traditional unemployment benefits. And I really didn't have a large part in that response, but in terms of their working with claimants who were applying for benefits, they set up a series of town halls that would respond to questions for claimants, and that eventually, as the pandemic evolved, began to address some of these workplace reentry issues that were going on in terms of providing a safe and healthy workplace for employees that were returning. So we started doing town halls that were focusing on this safety and health component, and Dr. Greg Holtzman, who's the state medical officer, would often be involved in those conversations. So starting work with DPHHS, I think Dr. Greg Holtzman has done a great job of proactively working to keep Montanans safe. And I spent the better part of 5 weeks over in Helena working for DPHHS this spring. I actually live in Missoula and work from home. But I came to appreciate that there was this kind of unique level of collaboration among the science and medical community, and that the state often relies on that to inform their practice as well. So I just wanted to share some of the experiences I had, and you'll see that the theme is common to what everybody else has mentioned in terms of the people, because it really is about the people that are working in the state of Montana. So at the beginning of the pandemic, the country was watching the state of Washington very closely. It became apparent that they were doing, there were facets of hospital preparedness, surge capacity planning, and that sort of thing that needed some more review and possibly some additional planning because of the unique circumstances with COVID. So within an extremely short amount of time, the state was able to access a group of medical providers through the Montana Hospital Association, which included pulmonary critical care docs, internal medicine physicians, pediatricians, disability advocates, and experts in medical ethics to kind of provide some element of consultation and reinforce planning efforts. So by means of that contact and working with that group in a very efficient manner on an extremely tight timeline, because this was back in March, this group was able to, they're managing not only the uncertainties of the pandemic and their day-to-day work and their own responsibilities, but they were able to come together and work through national guidance on topics to create plans that were really specific to Montana. And they did this without hesitation. And when I think back on the amount of volunteer hours this working group put forward on behalf of Montana communities and also their fellow medical providers, really in light of the complex nature of the materials they were managing, it really was awe-inspiring. And I never miss an opportunity to thank that group for their work and what they were able to do. And this is a group that kind of continues, and you'll see in my next example of this collaboration how they kind of came back and helped again. But I think it really demonstrates how these kind of collaborative and well-established working relationships with the medical community and partners out in the community and at the universities, because there were people from the university on this particular group as well, are real assets to the state. Another time that this became pretty apparent is when the Food and Drug Administration granted an emergency use authorization for the medication remdesivir, which is an antiviral medication for the treatment of COVID-19. And what happened with that is that Gilead donated a certain amount of this medication to the federal government, and then the states were charged with developing an allocation scheme for the donated product. So at that time, the medication was not commercially available and it was considered a scarce resource. And so appropriate allocation was of utmost importance, and we needed to be sure that it was being used judiciously. So fortunately, Dr. Holtzman and Jim Murphy, who is the chief of communicable disease, had this existing relationship with a state network of infectious disease docs, including Dr. Bloom, who met on a regular basis. And I was able to kind of tap into that resource and be able to talk about appropriate use criteria for this medication, which was really important and again needed to happen on a very condensed timeline. So this group readily mobilized, offered their clinical expertise, and worked with me one-on-one to develop this criteria for use. So, and then we could go back to the same group that I had consulted for the surge planning and have their take on it as well, including kind of this medical ethicist review. And I'm really not sure that that's possible in these very quick and accelerated timelines to do in other states. And I do feel like it really is a reflection of the willingness of Montana medical providers to kind of step out and step up and really help with the planning of these sorts of resources. I think that the state here really benefits from the expertise of these high caliber, academically minded professionals who are really out on the ground in clinical practice as well. And so I think that's a really important part of this conversation. And I know it keeps coming up as we go from person to person, that the people really matter. And I think just along those lines, I do my best to recruit people to Montana based on not only the academic environment of the universities, but also because it is a great place to live, and I think that we need to continue kind of doing that. So I think, the state really benefits when we can seek the expertise of these professionals. And I've always found in my limited experience here in the spring in terms of the pandemic response that they've responded with a lot of enthusiasm to make life better for their communities and their colleagues. And so I look forward to maintaining these connections beyond the pandemic, and really because they help advance public health for the state. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to Marshall.
Well, I feel sort of humbled to have listened to the four of you. And if I could have been guaranteed of the time, I would have put Maggie as the final speaker, because all of what we're talking about really funnels in ultimately to the application, the practical application of medical research, which is really public health. So I've got a few minutes to talk before we have to turn it back over for some question and answer. So I work here in Hamilton, Montana, and as I look at Jay and Jason, I can't help but reflect on how many of our alumni from Rocky Mountain Labs have ended up both over at Montana State U. Everybody, from Seth Pincus, who's one of the virologists over there, and Ivanka Voyich and others. And then to Jay, we've got a long history of faculty members at the University of Montana. And then, of course, another research institute, which we weren't able to include today, which is the McLaughlin Research Institute in Great Falls, which is also a really stellar institution. And so Rocky Mountain Labs, we go back well over 100 years. And as you guys were talking, I looked over on my shelf and I realized that I have right here a bottle of vaccine against Rocky Mountain spotted fever, which was prepared from tick tissues by the method of Spencer and Parker sometime before 1941. And this was, I don't know if this was commercially available or not, but it was given to all the kids in Western Montana. So I guess that's what would sort of pass for bioscience back in like the first half of the first third of the 20th century. And, really since then, Rocky Mountain Labs the scientists at Rocky Mountain Lab has played a pretty significant part in many of the emerging infectious diseases, of which the current pandemic is one. Throughout that time, going back to Rocky Mountain spotted fever, Q fever, yellow fever, pertussis, Lyme disease, Ebola virus, Zika virus, and now coronavirus, the COVID-19. And then, of course, as Jay mentioned, Edgar Reeby, who was here when I moved here in 1972, after he retired, went on to start the enterprise just down the road here, which has ended up in the GSK facility here, and then also in Jay's company. So I think for me, representing the scientists at Rocky Mountain Lab, it's very humbling and very cool that we've been able to have a part in those issues over so many years. And some of them, boy, they've had a lot of impact. Chronic wasting disease, Lyme disease. So that's sort of our history. We're Rocky Mountain Labs is sort of like a great big microbiology department with about 500 and some odd people and 20 equivalent of 20 professors. So I just thought what I would do is just give you a quick recitation of our involvement in this particular pandemic. And, we have people who are study emerging virus infections and, like myself, look at ProMed, which is a sort of a surveillance service for emerging medical issues. And, the first mentions of a new outbreak in China occurred, 2000, December 30th and December 31st. And we have investigators here who had been active in the SARS type 1 coronavirus outbreak, and then also the Middle East respiratory syndrome outbreak, which is another human coronavirus. And so when those investigators saw these kind of anxiety-inducing reports of a new coronavirus showing up in China, which looked as though they had the potential to cause a pneumonia and respiratory disease, they really went into gear in using the approach that they've used for MERS and other infectious diseases. Once the sequence of the virus was published and shown to be a beta human coronavirus related to SARS, they said, uh-oh. And they presented within, the month of January, presented a research proposal to the NIH officials back in Bethesda. Look, this is what we are going to need to do. And bang, after that, they went ahead and, they have done. Every time I always tell people, every time I see we, I mean they've really done a remarkable job in a variety of aspects, everything from disinfecting N95, showing the best way to disinfect an N95 respirator, to developing animal models, to actually testing remdesivir. That was actually done here. Testing some of the vaccines. That was actually done here. And then other investigators at Rocky Mountain Labs have really joined, after they told us all to go home and telework unless you're working on the coronavirus. So we have people who typically work on chlamydia now looking at the cell biology of the coronavirus and looking for potential countermeasures there. We have a group that works on salmonella, trying to see if salmonella can be used as a platform for some countermeasures. And then, we've been able to, offer some modest advice to the governor and work with the Montana Infectious Disease Doctors Network. So it's really been very gratifying to me. It's like I say, I don't take any credit for it, but I certainly take a lot of pride in the fact that RML was able to help the state. And we have partners at university. We have a lot of good partners at Montana State University. And the strong relationships that we have had with the health department and the governor's office and the other entities over in Helena and elsewhere. So I think it's really been for me and for us, and I know for all of us, a really exceptional opportunity to really become involved in something which is really significant and is going to be written about, like the 1918 flu was. And to know that those of us in the state of Montana at RML, at the University, Montana State, Vibliome and Maggie's at the health department and the state government really had a role in trying to set a good path for the state of Montana. Unfortunately, as I mentioned to the governor, we have this sort of contestatory social anthropology known as politics, which kind of intervenes. And as I was listening to you all talk, it struck me how incredible it is with the skill and the expertise and the communication abilities of the leaders in the university and the research that we have in the state of Montana, that we weren't more effectively able to penetrate that fog of misinformation. But, I think when it's all said and done, I think all of us on this panel, including Governor Bullock, can say, boy, we did the best we could, and we probably kept it from being a lot worse. And so again, I want to thank all of you for taking the time to be part of this panel. I want to thank the conference organizers, and God willing, in 6 months, we'll all be able to get together somewhere in between and all have a beer together. And finally, the only thing I want to say is, Bob, I noticed you got a guitar in the corner there. And I've got 2 banjos under my counter, but I never thought of putting them up so that they show on the screen. So
people really seem to respond to that on Zoom calls, which is all any of us ever do anymore. So
yeah, exactly. So we do have one question from Nicole Rush. Jason spoke about his effort breaking down barriers between public and private sectors. So what do we need to do as a state to keep those barriers down, or at least to lower those barriers, and sort of encourage the cross-sector collaboration that we've all talked about? And I think, Jason, you can answer it first, but I think I also want to hear what the rest of them have to say. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. Something we've actually talked a lot about is how do we keep up this momentum? We have developed relationships like we've never seen. And from what I've heard from faculty and researchers here is we've never had that good of a relationship with X, Y, and Z. And one of our partners, of course, is in a powerful partner of ours is DPHHS, and the relationship we've built with Jim Murphy, who Maggie mentioned, and the folks there. When this is done, we can't let that lapse. When I came from state of Michigan, and we had several universities, and we had a health solutions roundtable where we met. It was hospital CEOs, the vice president for research at each of our institutions, and folks like Rob and other industry leaders. And we would meet at least once a year just to talk about an issue, whether that issue be how do we it was back in the proactive nature. How do we lower hospital readmissions? How do we tackle this community health report that shows 1 out of 6 people in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan is living alone and elderly? I think that on the back end of this, Marshall, there's going to be a huge opportunity that we need to capitalize, where we keep these conversations going in some sort of health solutions roundtable like that, where we get executive buy-in. And that's really what was different about this one. It was sponsored by a foundation, a health foundation that we had, and they sponsored it. But we met, and it was the decision makers that met, and that was really, really important in building that trust and building that those long-term relationships. I hope we'll get to something like that on the back end of this. Great question.
Well, I would just echo it. I think for the broader community outside of COVID, I think being able to continue to overcome some of the geographic barriers that we have in Montana. We're all spread out all over the place. And, we're better at using all of the virtual tools now than we ever have been to run these kinds of meetings. But I think the challenge for all of us is to find a way to integrate better, to understand who can bring what pieces of the puzzle to the table, because we're going to need to do it in different ways, whether we're building a cluster, which is a lot of what this meeting is about, or whether we're trying to solve those problems that we're uniquely positioned to be able to do together. So I look forward to that in the next year.
Hey, you want to comment? And then I want to have Maggie have the last word.
No, absolutely. Clearly the strong public-private partnership that we've developed with the University of Montana and Inimmune has been key to the success here in Missoula. We're now extending that. There's other campuses, including MSU Billings, who are interested in understanding what we've done here with the Center for Translational Medicine to help this public-private partnership that's bringing jobs and resources to Missoula. But I've also been fortunate being in the vaccine industry, and I know Rob has a lot of history here too, being on a lot of calls in the last few months with how federal regulators have changed the requirements to help the vaccine setting go faster in the case of COVID, and why are we so quickly able to move into phase 3 clinical trials, but maintain the safety standards that we've always had. And it really has to do with changes in the ways of working with the regulators, everything from small biotech through big pharma companies, how they're interacting with HHS and the FDA in different ways to do this more rapidly than we ever thought was possible. If you'd asked me in January how fast it would take to get a new vaccine, I would say minimum 5 years, just based on where the standards were. And that's all changed very quickly. But I don't think it's changed with the sacrifice of safety. From what I'm hearing from regulators and other pharma companies that are going through the process. So I think these different new ways of working hopefully stay with us beyond this pandemic, and not only help us here in the state, but as a nation more quickly respond to challenges like this.
Yeah, I agree. And, before I turn it over to you, Maggie, I want to say something that Jason's idea about a health solutions roundtable, I think is really a good one. And maybe that's something you can bring back to the health department or maybe to the governor's office. One of the topics that I talked about briefly with him during the fireside chat was, sort of the post-pandemic phase and how we have to transition everything we're talking about to the next, to the next administration. And so it would be nice if part of those transition plans incorporated something along the ideas of, maintaining the network of non-government, of academics, so forth and so on, as a sort of a semi-formal roundtable or task force. So one of the things that we have a couple of more questions, but Maggie, I want you to have a chance to talk.
No, I think it's really important, and I mean the theme that we hear, because in so many different realms, for example. One small part of that is the adoption of technology for the use of delivering medical care, so telemedicine. And pre-pandemic, there were all these barriers, and there's not a lot of uptake for telemedicine. But when you have a need, it kind of supersedes all of that, and suddenly those barriers become so much. They're less significant, and you're able to overcome them. And so I think like the key ingredient here was obviously just an extreme need for people to kind of rapidly reconcile, who's bringing what to the table, and to really identify those parties that had. You want people that have the greatest strengths in different areas to come together and be able to kind of separate the wheat from the chaff kind of thing, so that you're coming out and you're really kind of accomplishing that goal. So I think that what everybody else on the panel has said is completely true. And I agree with you, Marshall, that the big part of this is to maintain those sorts of relationships beyond even this particular situation. And in some ways, I don't know how we can avoid doing that, because this really, I think, has shifted the way we view our partners, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that's a really insightful comment. And I mean, I guess the least we can all do is, not everybody's as old as I am. We can make an effort to, work with the next administration to try to keep that momentum going. So we had a couple of other questions, and I think Grant is okay with us going on with the questions for a few more minutes. Let me see if I get them in order here. So could you expand on the qualities of the Montana work ethic that Rob and Maggie spoke about? But I know that we all share that as a critical element in Montana, the work ethic. How do we continue, and I guess, Jason, they're pointing at you and Jay for this, how do we continue to cultivate those qualities of the Montana work ethic in tomorrow's students?
Jay, go ahead and
Yeah, I mean, and I'm sure MSU is the same, but here at the university, having internship programs, for us, it's lab-based experience and working. We have students working in the lab right now on a COVID vaccine. Those are the kinds of things that build the life experiences that these students in biotech need for the next step in their career. And we all hope that career is going to be here in Montana. But even if they go away, we find that those students often come back. A lot of our recruits are former graduates that maybe left and are wanting to come back to the state because of the lifestyle. And I think what we instill in those students now, in all forms of education, of course, we're focused in STEM, but there's lots of careers, everything from the engineering school at MSU to the law school here at U of M, educating students for success in the workforce is what our universities do well. Partner that with our lifestyle, and that's how we build our workforce. People that want to be here have great work ethic because they enjoy the lifestyle that they're able to have here in Montana and the jobs that they can do.
I would agree. I think each of the two flagship universities certainly provide amazing discovery-based learning opportunities that push the limits. I would, in addition to, I wouldn't just want to focus on the work ethic, which is important, but to combine that work ethic with creativity. And we found that during this pandemic, you've got to get creative. That coupling of that work ethic and creativity. I know I'm only a 14-month Montanan, but it seems like that's really what has stood out to me, is that work ethic combined with the level of creativity to be able to roll up our sleeves and work across boundaries. The boundaries are pretty low. Of course, if you're a Grizz and you're a Bobcat at a game, you're gonna hate each other. But we've been able to reach across the university system in this pandemic and help one another. Scott and I have weekly calls where we just talk about what's happening at the two universities. And we, as a result of that, we were able to take a very careful and couched approach to how we ramped down activity and then ramped it back up in a very responsible manner. So, and I don't want to dismiss also, I think it's important to say that there is a place for a lot of our other university partners in our community colleges. Not everybody is right away ready for a 4-year degree. To have these strong community colleges that can then feed into the broader system, or just to have some great 2-year programs that are necessary to bolster our healthcare as well. It's that entire ecosystem and being able to right size it and to be able to recruit talent and keep that talent. That's what I would focus on.
I think you're both. I think those are really salient points. And I guess the one thing I want to say, which kind of relates to one of the other questions that we have, is we talk about the ecosystem, but we're in an ecosystem, a larger ecosystem, and I really think that the ecosystem that we find ourselves in, the environment in Montana, which translates in the, sort of MBA parlance as quality of life. I think that I know that that's something that plays a role in our, getting people here to Rocky Mountain Labs. And, looks like we have about a minute and a half left. And I would just like each of you to say in about 30 seconds, what you think quality of life does for you.
So I'll take the first one. I think that if you can give people, when you're working together, the space to go out and take a hike at the end of the day, or take a powder day if it's snowing, then the attitude that they come in with the next day to work is 300% what they would have compared to if you work them 18 hours a day. I mean, and we're all prone to do that anyway, the working hard, but forcing yourself to take time and giving people the opportunity to take time and enjoy what's here, that makes a huge difference.
I can only say one thing. Yesterday afternoon, after work, I was about 10 minutes outside of my office here, waist deep in the Clark Fork River with a fly rod in my hand. So where else can you do that? And to be able to disconnect like that, especially when we're dealing with COVID and pandemic and everything else, to be able to social distance like we do in Montana is unique. And valuable, I'm sure, to everyone who works for our organizations here in the state.
Well, I'll end by saying, Marshall, it's why I'm here. My wife greenlighted three locations and three universities in the country that we agreed was that she would endorse me applying for if the right position came up. I was very happy with where I was at, but the opportunity to come to Montana State University, it was the right institution with the right makeup of faculty and the right environment. It's what attracted me here.
Well, I think we're out of time. So I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your day to do this. And, I think it's been a lot, whether the organizers got what they wanted, I don't know. But I think it was a lot of fun. So it's been a pleasure getting to talk to you all. And I hope we get to do it in person before too long. And I'll turn it over to you now, Grant.
Marshall, thank you. Thank you all so much for participating today. I was torn. I almost turned my phone off as a good MC, but I left it on silence, and I'm glad I did because I was getting text constantly about what a great conversation it was and how much people appreciated the chance to hear your thoughts. So that was rich and stimulating, and it gives us a lot to work with. And in terms of the organizers, I think organizers and audience have just really appreciated a chance to hear from you and to hear your thoughts. And really, I think the themes we are hearing from you, I think many people come to Montana for the quality of life, and they stay for the people. And it's the people who make your life richer, who make your jobs more meaningful and profitable. And we find time and time again that when we work with any industry, what we find makes the magic in Montana, it's the people and those relationships. And also, I think what I heard are some themes about some of our challenges and some of the needs, and we really need to make sure that as we move forward, we have the right access to capital and the right facilities and the right teams of people. So you guys have given us a lot to think about, and our commitment to all of you and all of you as participants is that this is not just a big talking and listening session, but really we'll do some deep thinking at the end of this and try to turn this into actions that really help us move the state forward. And we'll look forward to calling on all of you to assist in that process as we do so. So for our audience, thank you for participating today, for joining the conversation. And what I'll share with you is we have 2 outstanding days ahead of us. I regret to say, and I wish it weren't the case, that today we registered historic levels of new cases of COVID in Montana. By no means, despite being 6 months into this pandemic, are we out of the woods. And most people predicted an autumn spike, and it feels like it's coming earlier than some expected. But I think tomorrow we're going to really hear what's happening on the front lines. And we'll also hear from some folks about ways that we might be able to encourage our private sector, our partnerships, each other to really continue to rise to the occasion, to identify those places where we can meet some of the existing challenges we face today, as well as lay the groundwork for a much stronger sector and community and economy going forward. I would be remiss if I didn't take one more chance to just say a huge thanks to our sponsors. Without our sponsors, today would not have been possible. Thank you to the Montana Bioscience Cluster Initiative, to C2M Beta, powered by Blackfoot, the Governor's Office of Economic Development, to Bear Capital, and the Montana Bioscience Alliance. All of them are instrumental in the work that's being done across the state, and we're certainly instrumental into us being able to put this 3-day session together. With that, we will have a chance to finish a little early, but I will just remind folks we're looking forward to getting started tomorrow at 11 o'clock, and I really hope that we will virtually see you then. Thank you for joining us. Take care.